One was Ukraine's neutrality, so non-NATO, neutral, number one. Number two, that Russia would continue to hold Crimea, whether by agreement or de facto. Russia views Crimea as a particular matter of national security for a true reason, which is that since 1783, that's the place of its naval base in the Black Sea, and that is central to Russia's national security. And I think that that's true. And the third was that the Minsk II agreement to address the Donbass would be implemented. And the Minsk II agreement came in 2014 and 2015 after the events of 2014 to give autonomy to the Donbass. And that's where the heavy Russian-speaking population is, and that's the site of the war right now. And the idea was that there would be some kind of constitutional autonomy, and this was signed by Ukraine and guaranteed by Germany and France in the so-called Normandy process. It was never implemented. My Ukrainian counterparts tell me, of course we would never implement that. We signed it, yes, but we would never implement it. A few weeks ago, former Chancellor Merkel, who was a guarantor of the agreement, she said, I don't even know whether it's true now what she said or what she said then. She said, no, it was a holding period to allow Ukraine to strengthen itself. We didn't expect it to be implemented, which is a remarkable statement to make because Germany was a guarantor of the agreement. That means that they're supposed to ensure that it's implemented. Whatever the case, those three positions that Putin put on the table at the end of 2021 made sense. They really made sense because not expanding NATO, in my view, is not a concession, it's common sense. Do you actually really want to provoke a conflict, or do you want to keep a safe space? I say keep a safe space. So that one wasn't a concession, that just made sense to me. Crimea makes sense to me also, I have to say, that fighting to take it back could lead us to nuclear war, and we should understand the practicalities of this. And what Yanukovych was trying to do in 2011 was to negotiate a long-term lease arrangement with Russia that would last at least till 2041. Well, that would have been smart, but he was under a lot of Western pressure. And then Minsk II, sign, implemented. Well, we turned down that basis. So everything got worse. Everything's worse. Not only have hundreds of thousands of people died, we don't know how many, and massive destruction by now, but Russia annexed 4 regions. Okay, this makes it a lot harder. We don't even know what diplomacy would exactly mean right now. But to my mind, we remain 3 core issues. And the core issues are neutrality or NATO enlargement is one issue. The second issue is Crimea. And the third issue is Donbass, but unfortunately now with the Kherson region and Zaporozhye region thrown into this terrible mix. But what does it mean? In my view, it means that what this war is about is politics. It's not about some crazy, it's not about, in my opinion, Putin thinking he's Peter the Great. It's not about the Western propaganda. It's not about Hitler in 1938. It's actually about NATO and Ukraine and all these issues which have been on the table for 30 years. So we should face them politically. And this is, I think, what Clausewitz meant by his most famous expression, that war is politics with other means. In other words, we're still dealing with politics, so we need to have a political discussion about this right now.
So you mentioned in one of your recent articles that neutral countries, including those of the Global South, can play an important role in this. Again, the world has changed tremendously since the beginning of this latest era in the history, and so on and so forth. So you have a different global layout when it comes to economic power. And G7 is on the one hand, and then you have BRICS and the rest of the Global South. So how do you see the role of the Global South, and BRICS in particular, in balancing out the future of world, both security and economy?
My view is that the whole world plays a role in ending this conflict for one very basic reason. If the world really subscribed to the American and European narrative, that this is an unprovoked war, that there are no issues, that Russia just needs to leave, and that it's horrendous crimes and so forth, if that were the view around the world, the whole world would have joined in the sanctions, and Russia really would not have been able to carry on a war. It wouldn't have changed the regime and so forth, as I mentioned, even with Maduro. But Russia has been able to do what it does because it's got friends all over the world that don't subscribe to the dominant EU-US narrative. They think everybody agrees with them, but that's basically because they listen to themselves. They're not talking with the rest of the world. I am talking with a lot of world leaders who say, yeah, this is a contest between the US and Russia. We don't want to take sides in that. So my point has always been, at least make it clear that this is not a war about NATO enlargement, is what I've said to the US, for example, from December 2021 onward. Say NATO isn't enlarging, and that if Putin invades, there's no provocation for that. Make it clear. No, we won't make it clear. The door is open. It's an open door policy. Well, come on. They can't even win the international support on that because it's quite logical that it is a NATO enlargement war. And they don't say, they won't admit that, or they won't deny that. They won't say anything about it. So this is my point about why these other countries. Let's get things on the record. Is the US wanting to enlarge NATO? If they had any sense at all, they would say no. It was a terrible idea in 2008, and we understand it's a terrible idea. It crosses the red line of a major power that has 1,700 nuclear weapons. Thank you. It wasn't such a good idea. So just like in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have a compromise to create some space, exactly the way the crisis was solved 60 years ago. If they said that, and there were negotiations that made all of this clear, and the whole rest of the world said, you know, now this makes sense, and we will hold accountable the party that breaks this agreement, then you're talking, because then just willfully invading the other side in complete contradiction to what you've agreed really would provoke a worldwide storm. And that's what I'm basically proposing, which is that there are plenty of countries that are ready to guarantee an agreement, and countries that matter. And let me take the case of China, for example. What is China's position on this war? China does not want this war. Of course, China doesn't want Russia to lose this war and NATO to win, especially because, unbelievably, the Secretary General of NATO today is in Asia to try to make a NATO-Asia alliance against China. Duh. Excuse me. What does NATO stand for? North Atlantic. Does it stand for World War III? Does it stand for U.S. Expeditionary Force? No, it stands for North Atlantic. It was to guard against an invasion by the Soviet Union, which I guarantee is not going to happen because it doesn't exist anymore. So why is the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, in Korea today? Because they have no restraint. Because now NATO wants to take a position against China, which is it's really, okay. I'm coming back to your question. So what does all this mean? Put reasonable terms on the table, agree on reasonable terms, and then reasonable nations will help to ensure those terms. And the reason I was mentioning China is that China has said all along, we want the war to stop, which they really do when I talk to a lot of Chinese senior officials, but we want Russia's security interests to be respected as well. In the West, that's regarded as ludicrous, but what it really means is no NATO enlargement, which is neither ludicrous nor of uninterest to China, which doesn't like NATO exactly right now, especially since they're traipsing around East Asia to try to organize an alliance against China. So all of this is to say there are lots of important countries in the world that actually want peace. And I mentioned Argentina, Brazil, India, which is president of the G20 this year, China, South Africa. They're not warmongers. They're not anti-Ukraine. They just happen also not to be anti-Russia. And they could help to guarantee a peace. But to guarantee a peace, there has to be a clear agreement. What does each side say? The U.S. side has to say, we will not enlarge NATO. And the Russian side has to say, we will put our troops home. Those are the 2 points. That's observable. And I think the world could help to enforce such a basic agreement.